Welcome to the Palestine Chronicle. I'm your host, Robert Inlakesh. In today's show, we'll be bringing you an interview with Professor Mohammed Marandi, an expert on post-colonial literature and an academic at the University of Tehran. Our interview focused on Iran's retaliatory military operation against Israel, in addition to the Islamic Republic of Iran's role in supporting the Palestinian Resistance in Gaza. We got into a number of issues, including the justifications behind armed struggle against an occupying power, and why Israel has been dealt a number of blows over the past 6 months. Thank you for being here with us on Palestine Chronicle. And I want to jump right into things. Obviously, we've seen what's been happening over the past few days and the media's reaction to Iran's retaliatory strikes. How successful, in your mind, were these strikes? We hear from the corporate media and the Israelis that 99% of all the munitions fired were shot down. It was a massive success. They've now given a name to their defensive operation, they say, which they collaborated with the United Kingdom, France, and the US and others like Jordan to conduct. How successful do you think that Iran's retaliatory actions and strikes were?
It was a complete success. There's no doubt about it. The corporate media can say what it wants. They've been dishonest from the beginning. They've been supporting the Israeli genocide. They're partners in crime in Gaza. So if they were to admit the truth about Iran's retaliation to the Israeli crimes, I would be shocked. I would really be shocked. When you see the British foreign minister, the foreign secretary, humiliated on TV by Sky News, which is very sympathetic, that just shows how bad it is. When he said how evil Iran was, and I think you probably saw it. I think many people have seen it. And the interviewer, she said, "Well, what if it was if there was a British embassy that was bombed or consulate?" And he said, "Well, we would respond." So the hypocrisy in everything they say and everything they do is, whether it's the government or the media, it's clear for us all to see. The world has changed, and I think Western corporate media has been pretty much exposed for at least the more questioning sort of people. What happened was that the Israelis carried out a crime. The Iranians did the smart thing. First, they went to the UN. The world condemned it, except for a number of Western countries, as usual. And the UN Security Council did not condemn the Israeli regime, let alone punish it, because the US, France, and Britain refused to condemn it. In other words, they supported the bombing of the Iranian embassy, and so did other countries like Germany. But the Iranians received global support, and that gave Iran an opportunity to strike back at the Israelis, because there was a consensus across the world about what the Israeli regime had done to Iran. Until then, the Iranians had shown patience during the Western dirty war in Syria, where they supported ISIS and Al-Qaeda and other extremist groups. Iran sent advisors and sometimes troops to Syria when there were tens of thousands of foreign fighters there. And at that time, the Israelis would target Iranians, but the Iranians didn't retaliate back then because the focus was on defeating the extremists, the Western-backed extremists. And later on, more recently, when the genocide in Gaza began, again, because of Iran's support for the resistance, the Israelis attacked Iranian advisors and officers, and the Iranians still remained patient. But by striking the embassy, the Iranians were forced to respond, because this was a major act of aggression. It was an attack on our sovereignty. And if Iran hadn't responded, the Israelis would have continued to bomb other embassies and other buildings in Damascus as well that belonged to the embassy. So Iran had to make sure that this wasn't repeated. And so what Iran did was that it waited for well over 10 days. So it carried out psychological warfare with the Israelis. And then the Iranians notified everyone that they were going to carry out an attack. They warned countries in the region that have American bases that if the US uses your bases, we will punish you. And they backed off. And the Iranians knew that the Jordanians were going to cooperate. They knew that the Americans were going to be involved. And the Americans basically were the ones who had the most prominent role here. But Iran was very smart. They made these announcements. They launched the drones, a large number of very old and cheap, inexpensive drones that had none of the Iranian latest technology. And the Americans and the Israelis and the others had ample time to prepare themselves. So when the drones reached Palestine, the Americans started, and the Israelis and the others started to shoot them down, but they didn't understand that these were A, decoys, B, a means to gather intelligence, because the Americans and the Israelis were using all of their capabilities. And so the Iranians learned a lot, whereas they gave nothing. And C, they were using very expensive missiles to down these dirt cheap drones. So ultimately, the drones probably costed a couple of $1 million, maybe. I mean, they're very old. They had to get rid of them somehow. So they're not even worth a couple of $1 million, I guess, to the Iranians. And the Israelis alone spent over $1.3 billion. So the damage done to the Israelis is quite significant. Those missiles are very expensive, but also there are not very many of them out there because a lot are being used in Ukraine as well. So there's a shortage of these missiles. So Iran gathered its intelligence, and also the Iranians fired a series of older missiles, and again, they were meant to have the air defenses attack them, and they were for gathering intelligence, but they were also decoys, and they had no modern Iranian or new technology that could be of value to the United States or the Israelis. So they were also downed. Another expensive act on the Israeli behalf and the Americans. And then the Iranians also fired a handful, I don't know, maybe 10 to 20 missiles that were directed at two military targets, an air base in the south and a military intelligence gathering base in the north. And those missiles struck their targets. So the Israelis, and these were two of the most well-protected places in Israel. The air base in the south is where the F-35s are. It's where they carry out the airstrikes against Gazans. It's where the planes came from when they attacked the Iranian embassy. So the Iranians sent a very clear message to the Israelis that we can hit you very easily. The Iranians forced them to cough up a lot of money. The Iranians gained a lot of intelligence. They depleted the Israeli and American missiles. And so if the Israelis, and then more importantly, the Iranians said, we've changed the equation. From now on, it doesn't matter if the Israelis attack Iranians in Syria who are not in the embassy. Any Iranian that's attacked anywhere in the world, or any Iranian asset that's attacked anywhere in the world, Iran will directly attack Israel. So that has changed everything. It makes things far more difficult for the Israelis than before. It's narrowed down the room for maneuver for the Israeli regime. This, I think, is even more important than the operation itself. So if the Israelis carry out an attack on Iran or an attack on Iranian assets abroad, they will see a massive response not what we saw a couple of nights ago. What happened a couple of nights ago was an intelligence gathering operation. It was also signaling to the Israelis that we can hit your most important bases. And it also caused, it forced the Israelis and the Americans to spend a lot of their resources. And for Iran, it was literally free. When I say the Iranians spent a few $1,000,000, I don't know in all how much it would have costed, maybe 10, 15, I don't know. But a lot of these old missiles and drones are not really worth anything because they're not going to be sold anywhere. They're old. So it was almost, for Iran, perhaps almost free carrying out this operation.
Well, it was interesting looking at it. Obviously, I'm no military expert here, but looking at it, the entirety of the incident lasted about 5 hours. And of course, all flights were grounded. There was a lot of pre-warning as well, and yet still missiles managed to hit their targets, which to myself seemed very significant. And you said that this is now a new equation, and we've heard this from Iranian officials as well, that the equation has changed. Just focusing in on a little bit of the context, because obviously there are decades of context that we could go into. At the start of the year, actually late December, the Israelis launched their first attack on Damascus, assassinating an IRGC official. At this time, shortly afterwards, we saw that Iran did hit Mossad targets and Mossad headquarters, they said, in northern Iraq, and also there were missiles fired into Syria's Idlib. At that time, it appeared that Iran was threatening a retaliation and signaling that it was going to retaliate. Then we saw two actions carried out after that by the Israelis, the assassination of, I believe, 5 IRGC members in Damascus, and then after that as well, what I believe the New York Times reported was Israeli involvement in what appeared to be sabotage operations inside of Iran. After that, we didn't see anything until the attack on the consular segment of the Iranian embassy. My question to you is, how much in Iran's strategic thinking here has the conflict in Gaza, the genocide in Gaza, affected the thinking of Iran when it comes to actually responding to the Israelis? What consideration is made of Gaza and what the Palestinian resistance is currently doing in resisting, but also attempting to reach a ceasefire and negotiations? Does that have any link, or are these two issues separate?
Well, Iran's support for the Palestinian cause goes back to the beginning of the revolution. And the military capabilities that you see today in Gaza are because of the heroic efforts of Hamas and Islamic Jihad and their allies and the other groups in Gaza. But of course, it's because of the support that Iran has been giving to them over the decades. All those tunnels and those capabilities that you see today that have bogged the Israeli regime down, they didn't come out of the blue. They're all from Iran. The Iranians helped a lot. They invested a lot to create those capabilities. So for Iran, the people of Gaza and the people of Palestine are extremely important. The reason why Iran has been sanctioned so heavily over the past few decades, and the reason why the U.S. imposed maximum pressure sanctions under Obama and again under Trump, was not because of the nuclear program or because of human rights or terrorism or whatever excuse the Americans or the Europeans would use. It's because of Iran's support for the Palestinian cause. And therefore, there's no country that has sacrificed as much as Iran for the sake of Palestine willingly. Of course, besides Syria and Lebanon and Yemen, and of course the Palestinian people themselves. So, and the dirty war in Syria, I think it's becoming increasingly clear to people that the reason why they carried out that dirty war was to prevent Iran from helping build this network of resistance. They wanted to destroy Syria, fragment Syria, and NATO was behind it all. And sadly, back then, a lot of people were fooled. These dictatorships in the region were using sectarianism, and NATO and regional countries were funding the most evil of terrorist groups and calling them freedom fighters. And most people were fooled, because whenever you say Iran, immediately there is a consensus among the dictatorships in the region and Western regimes, and they work together to create sectarian hatred, racial hatred, and Iranophobia and Islamophobia. And it's been pretty effective in the past. So that dirty war, and we all, I think you know, as well as I, from the very beginning, we had the email that was leaked by WikiLeaks, where Jake Sullivan, the current national security advisor, told Hillary Clinton, who was the Secretary of State back then, that Al-Qaeda is on our side in early 2012. So from the very beginning, the US was working with the terrorists. And when Iran was saying this back then, unfortunately, many people were rejecting it. But later, then we had the Defense Intelligence Agency document of 2012. We had the leaked audio of the subsequent Secretary of State of the United States, Kerry, where he said that we allowed ISIS to advance on Damascus. It was clear what was going on in Syria. And the objective back then was to break the link between the resistance and Iran. Because Syria played a major role in helping Hamas and Islamic Jihad and Hezbollah and so on. So Iran has invested a lot, both by preventing the dirty war in Syria from succeeding, by creating and helping to create the defense systems and defense capabilities in Gaza and Lebanon, and of course in Yemen, Iraq, and Syria. So obviously, Iran is not going to allow the genocide to be forgotten in this exchange. And that is why the Iranians showed strategic patience when their officers were being murdered by the Israeli regime in Syria. But this time round, the Iranians had to react, because as I said, when the Israeli regime bombs an embassy, then they can bomb other embassies. No one is safe anymore. And so therefore the Iranians had to respond. But I think actually the Israeli regime made a major mistake, because forget the West, forget the Western mainstream media and Western governments. They are isolated now. The world has seen what they've done in Gaza. They have no credibility. Their image has been wrecked. Their soft power demolished. The fact that they effectively supported the attack on the Iranian embassy, they've been exposed to everyone. But the rest of the world, they supported the Iranian act. So the world is not going to look away from Gaza and because of what the Israelis and the Iranians are doing to each other. But I think that actually what Iran did strengthened the resistance, because the Israelis now have a new cause for concern. They see the Iranian power. Again, forget the Western media. They can pretend. I mean, they've been saying for 2 years that Ukraine has won, Ukraine is winning, and Russia is losing. And now they're suddenly everyone's worried about the fate of Kiev. They've been lying. They've been lying to their public. They've been wasting hundreds of billions of dollars for nothing. And they've lost trillions of dollars because of the sanctions, and because of the fact that they no longer have access to cheap gas and fuel. But suddenly now we're being told that things in Kiev are not good. But so what about all the things that we've been told over the past couple of years? So the Western media has no credibility, and we shouldn't really concern ourselves with that. The fact is that the Israelis know that if they attack Iran, they'll be hit very hard. And it's a big morale boost for the Palestinians. We saw when the drones were coming in, or the missiles were coming in, or when a missile would strike the military bases, because there's footage of that. We saw how the Palestinians were celebrating, and how for the first time in 6 months, Palestinians in Gaza were saying that there were no drones striking us, and for once we slept at night, and which many in Iran, when they heard that news, like in the news, on television, or when the people were celebrating and they were told that Palestinians were had slept that night for the first time, Iranians were weeping to hear the news. So it was for many an emotional moment. So I think it was a big mistake by the Israelis, and the Israelis have lost in Gaza militarily. They've lost on the border with Lebanon militarily. Their escalation with Iran will lead to further loss. There's no escaping defeat. The further they push, the further they escalate, the greater the defeat will be for this horrible apartheid regime. And another reason why it's very clear, another, let's say, piece of evidence that shows that the Americans are incapable of, or the Israelis are incapable of blocking Iranian missiles and drones when they want to hit them, is Yemen. The Americans and the British came in and said they're going to deal with Yemen. The Israelis said that no ships are going through. And Yemen does not have the drones and missiles that Iran has. The Americans and the British and the Israelis have failed completely in the Red Sea. And they've only hurt themselves, because every time the Yemen uses the same strategy as Iran does. They send a bunch of cheap drones out there. The Americans and the British and others are forced to fire all sorts of expensive missiles. And the Yemeni armed forces and Ansar laugh at them. And then when a ship comes that they have to strike, they fire a single missile and they hit their target. That's exactly what the Iranians are doing. That's exactly what Hamas and Islamic Jihad also did. If you recall, they would fire lots of rockets at Israel, and the Iron Dome would bring them down. And the Israelis would say this is a great success, but in reality, it's a great failure, because they were sending like what, $500 rockets, and the Israelis would knock them down with like, I don't know, $50,000 missiles. It's for the Israelis, all of this is simply a failure, but they refuse to acknowledge it because they have to preserve that image of power. But in reality, the Israeli regime has shown itself to be barbaric to the world. It has shown itself to be weak and vulnerable. It has failed in intelligence gathering, as we saw on October the 7th. It's failed to militarily, because it's never been able to capture this small dot on the map called Gaza after 6 months, and it's exposed itself, as I said, as a barbaric and brutal regime that is similar, if not worse, than the Nazis in the Second World War, because of the sheer hypocrisy that they show. They massacre people and they pretend to be the victims. At least the Nazis, when they massacred people, they weren't telling, and they weren't doing it in front of the eyes of the world. This is something actually that's unprecedented. Saddam Hussein, Hitler, whoever, all the dictators and of old, none of them massacred people in front of a live audience. This is the first time that it's being done, and the Israelis in the West have been supporting it. So they're the victim, but they're carrying out genocide in front of a live audience, and they expect the world to believe what they say.
Well, it's interesting because there's obviously a lot to unpack from what you just said there, but specifically honing in on the strategy of different resistance groups, and of course Iran and Yemen, as well as actual countries participating in battles with the Israelis and responses to the Israelis. A lot of people leveled the criticism at Hamas, Islamic Jihad, the PFLP, and the other groups that exist in Gaza, that its rocket fire was only a justification for Israel to hit them back. And because the rockets weren't doing a great amount of damage, they were essentially useless, and they helped build, let's say, a propaganda narrative for the Israelis to claim to be the victim. Similarly, what we've seen here is that with Iran's retaliation, there's been the narrative that because not every single drone got through, and we don't see videos of carnage in Tel Aviv and Haifa, then somehow this means that it's an excuse for the Israelis now to claim victim, and that this didn't have any sort of impact. And this is the narrative that I've seen that has been spread throughout not only Western media, but also we've seen in Gulf media as well. We've seen this argued the same way, that this is simply a justification now for Israel to play victim after what it did in Gaza, and that we shouldn't pay any attention to what the actual strategy of that retaliatory strike was, similar to how we're not supposed to pay any attention to why Palestinians in Gaza, obviously these are two separate things on different scales of what the weaponry can do as well, why they actually fire those rockets. So what would your response be to that narrative that Iran simply gave Israel the ability to play victim and then carry out whatever aggression it seeks, whether in Gaza, Iran, Syria, Lebanon, wherever else?
Yes, these are the arguments made by those who don't do anything for Palestine. They don't fund the resistance groups. They just sit back and either do business with the Israelis or they do nothing at best. Maybe some people think that if they tweet a few things or retweet a few things, that they're making a big difference. Those who are paying the price are the ones who can really make a legitimate argument or argue these issues. Countries in the Persian Gulf, they have from top to bottom, they have relations with the Israeli regime, every single one of them. And the Americans are and the Europeans are very influential across the Persian Gulf. There's not one exception to the rule. Some of them do trade, extensive trade with Israel, like the Emiratis, and they have military and intelligence cooperation with one another. Oh, and the Emiratis are, by the way, putting themselves at risk as a result, but that's for another time. Turkey, despite all the rhetoric, it's been exporting and importing from Israel. It's been doing business as usual for the last few months. So it's obvious that those who are indifferent or have been effectively indifferent to what's going on in Gaza, that they would make any excuse to justify their own actions or inactions. And of course, the West would do the same. They are the ones who are supporting the genocide. They don't care about the people of Gaza. So when Western mainstream media makes this argument, it's highly hypocritical too, because if the Iranians did not strike the Israelis, it wouldn't have made a difference in their policy towards Gaza. So the fact remains that those countries or those groups that are putting pressure on the Israelis are the axis of resistance. No one else is doing anything enormous. Maybe one could say that Al Jazeera Arabic is playing a role, but you have to look at it within a context. Al Jazeera Arabic is allowed to play that role by the Americans because there's a complicated relationship between Qatar and Israel and the role that Qatar wants to play. I'm not saying that it's there aren't sincere people working there. There are a lot of decent people working in Al Jazeera, and especially in Al Jazeera Arabic. You see a strong amount of support for the cause, but Qatar has not paid a price for its support for Palestine, and it hasn't been suffering like Iranians have, or the Lebanese, or the Syrians. In fact, many of these countries helped destroy Syria and created the devastation that we see today. And even today, they still pretend that they were supporting the right cause by funding ISIS and Al Qaeda and Ahrar al-Sham or Jaish al-Islam, and the different terror groups that and the terror groups that the Israelis never bomb, The Americans never bomb. The funding, they're neighboring NATO countries, whether it's in Idlib or in Al Tanaf, where the Americans are, they're all safe and sound. So I think it's understandable why some people would make this argument, but that's nonsense. In 2018 and 2019, during the Great March of Return, the people of Gaza didn't even use rockets. They were just marching. Sometimes they'd throw stones. What happened then? 240, 250 of them were murdered by the Israelis. Many of them were maimed for life because the Israelis would target their kneecaps or their arms, and they would, celebrate, and they would, there's a lot of evidence about what they did during the Great March of Return, and the Western media ignored it all, even though it was outrageous. There was footage where the Israeli soldiers would say, I could hit that guy like a kilometer off and I could hit him in the knee, and then when they'd hit him, they'd all jump up and down or celebrate. This is the sort of the brutal, barbaric, illegitimate regime that we're talking about. So when the Gazans fire off rockets, well, if these governments are so upset, then they can go and fund them and give them more weapons and more advanced weapons and more support alongside the Iranians. But what the Gazans have done, whatever it is, it has succeeded because the Israelis have been unable, after 6 months, to take Gaza. And those rockets that have had no impact or little impact, according to these people, those rockets have forced Israelis to spend a large amount of money to counter them, and it has created fear among Israelis. That's why many of the settlements around Gaza are empty now. So it's caused a lot of financial difficulty for the Israeli regime, and resources have to be put in place to block the rockets. But so it's been a part of the broader military strategy of the resistance, and Hamas has shown its capabilities both through the heroic acts of its members during these 6 months, but also through its innovative strategies and the brilliance that its commanders and the commanders of Jihad and the others have shown. No one can deny the achievements of the resistance. If they want, they can say, well, why all these people have been murdered? Yes, of course. But that's what the enemy did. That's not what they did. If they're going to halt resistance because the other side is evil, then the Algerians shouldn't have resisted the French. In the Indian subcontinent, no one should have resisted the British. In South Africa, no one should have, or in Southern Africa, no one should have resisted against the white supremacists. So all we have to do is say, well, the other side is brutal, so, submit. That is not acceptable to many people across the world. Many do submit. We see that submission. We see that submission among all those countries that have political relations and business relations with the Israeli regime, or intelligence or military relations with the Israeli regime. They've all submitted in one form or another to the powers that be. But the axis of resistance from Gaza to Yemen to Lebanon and Iraq and Syria and Iran, that's not within their worldview. They don't believe that.
Well, it's interesting because you brought up the Great March of Return, and I think that's very important to properly analyzing what's going on here and understanding armed resistance as well, and why we see the kind of armed resistance we see today, specifically in Gaza. But that can also be transferred over to other fronts as well, that if there is passivity when it comes in the face of overwhelming violence, then the violence will continue and it can be seen as a right for a free-for-all. And so there has to be some sort of retaliation. In Gaza in 2017, Hamas were attempting to do a deal with the Palestinian Authority to bring them in to take over the civil administration. The United States is understood to have been the reason for blocking that. That could have helped lift the siege and ease the lives of Gazans. The following year, we saw that Hamas and all the Palestinian factions endorsed the Great Return March, which was overwhelmingly non-violent. I mean, if you're going to call it violent, it's throwing stones at soldiers with sniper rifles across a militarized fence. And like you said, mass murder of men, women, children, the elderly, journalists, medical workers, and the world did not care. There was absolutely very minimal coverage. When they did cover it, they talked about Israel's right to defend its border against these unarmed people. And I think after that, and after months and months of the Israelis bombarding Gaza, during which Hamas didn't actually respond, then we saw later in the year that there was an escalation. And from there, we started seeing that the stance of the resistance in Gaza actually became more aggressive because they actually tried those peaceful routes. That is actually something there. And in the case of Iran, as far as I can see it, I've seen that we can look back to the assassination of Mohsen Fakhrizadeh. We can look back to many acts of sabotage in the assassination of nuclear scientists dating back to perhaps 2010. And we haven't seen a direct strike on the Israelis. We have seen restraint. Obviously, there have been responses, but we've seen restraint. And when you rob the context from the situation, like is often done, then this creates a situation where you can start to point fingers. Well, if you resist, then you're going to get somebody firing back at you and committing such and such heinous crimes. The question off the back of that is talking about the agency of different groups in the region and countries in the region, why they choose to resist, is there's often the question, and perhaps we'll end on this note and discussing this. There's often the question of how much influence Iran has over Islamic Jihad and Hamas and all the different resistance groups in Gaza, as well as throughout the region. We hear in Western corporate media that Iran has proxies and that these proxies act on their behalf, and that Iran is playing a big game in order to destroy Israel and combat Israel, and it pulls all the strings at every single moment, and none of these groups have any agency, and they even add in a lot of sectarian language. What's your response when people say things like this, for instance, that Iran has complete control over its proxies, as they call them? How would you respond?
No, Iran doesn't have any proxies in the region. These are all Iranian allies. And that's exactly the difference between Iran and these Western regimes or their regional client regimes, in that they do have proxies and they think that Iran is like them. It's the opposite. Iran's relationship with Hamas is one of two allies. With Islamic Jihad, it's the same with the other groups, with all of the Palestinian groups that are carrying out resistance. Iran has a brotherly relationship, and Iran supports them. Iran doesn't tell them what to do. They know what to do. They're on the ground. They know better what needs to be done to protect their people, whether it's in Gaza or the West Bank, or hopefully in future within the 1967 borders. They know best. But Iran's responsibility is to empower them. The same is true in Lebanon, the same is true in Yemen, and the same is true in Iraq and Syria. All of them, and the reason why they're all working together is that they are all ideologically close to one another. They are anti-Zionist, they're anti-racist, they are anti-imperialist, they're opposed to colonization and Western domination, and they are therefore working together, and their relationships have become closer and closer, especially during the past 6 months. So they all have agency. Denying them agency is actually increases miscalculation in the West. Just like the Iranian retaliation against the Israeli regime, if they want to call it a victory for Israel, that's fine. We don't care. We're not out there to win public approval in the West. They can, they can fool their own people or their elites as much as they want. What's important is what happens on the ground here. and they can call these people proxies. That's fine. It only leads to further miscalculation, because proxies are the sort of people that when the money runs out, they disappear. And that's one major reason why they sanctioned Iranians and tried. But even during difficult times, these resistance movements continue to grow. Why? Because they believed in what they were doing. They believe in what they're doing. Hamas is what their cause is a just cause. We have a responsibility to support Hamas. We not only do we not condemn Hamas, we commend Hamas for October the 7th. We commend Hamas and their allies for what they did on October the 7th. Maybe some combatant carried out a crime here, or someone did something wrong there, or some innocent child. That's true. And the same is true about the French resistance. And the same is true when the ANC was struggling for independence, and when the Algerians were fighting against French occupation. All of this can be true, but you, again, as you were saying earlier, you have to look at it within context. You have to look at the broader picture. Hamas, when they took these, of course, all the rape allegations were untrue, the beheadings were untrue, and the reason I think that the West tried to push this so much later on, it was after the exchange of prisoners that this became a big issue. And it was, I think, because the Israeli prisoners that were released were smiling, and they were, sometimes hugging the resistance fighters, and that was something that shocked the Western public. So they had to start making these claims about, or building upon, or pushing these outrageous claims that are very Orientalist, by the way, because the Orientalist stereotype about the hypersexualized Arab man, and that sort of thing has been around for centuries, and they play on that sort of thing. So what Hamas did was a response to decades of injustice, to decades of murder and ethnic cleansing. Gaza was a concentration camp turned into a death camp. It has been bombed repeatedly over the years. The people have been put under siege for decades, and any dignified human being would not accept that state of affairs. So people can complain about the tactics of Hamas or Islamic Jihad or Hezbollah or Iran, but first they should pick up a stone and throw it, at least throw a single stone somewhere, and then they can start complaining about the tactics or the strategy of the resistance.
Well, I think it's very.
And one final thing that I should add is that during the Great March of Return, it wasn't only stone-throwing youth that were being killed. Old women carrying flags were being murdered. Young female medics way in the back of the crowd were murdered by snipers. They were true monsters, and just as they are today. Israel is a racist regime with a racist population, and the West is responsible for this, not because they enable it, but because for decades they've pampered these racists, and therefore they've strengthened these racist narratives, which have led to the atrocities that we see today.
And I think that's very key context when we're looking at this, because, some people, they might hear you say what you said about Hamas and October 7, and because they have the narrative which has been fed to them, which includes all of these atrocity propaganda points, but also that, robbing the military offensive of any military value and just pretending like soldiers weren't targeted and there was no meaning to it. It was just an attack for the sake of instilling terror into Israelis. They forget history, I think, and that is very key. You mentioned, for instance, in the case of Algeria, the Algerian resistance had planted bombs in packed areas for the white settlers. That's true, and they killed white settlers. Also, even if you want to go back to the Haitian Revolution, at one point Dessalines gave the order, we're told, according to history, kill all whites. That was to go and kill them all. But there is context behind that, and obviously what happened was as well nuanced. It's not very just simple what actually happened there. But if we look at the results of the Haitian Revolution, they abolished slavery before France and Britain. If we look at Algeria, they gained independence for their country. And I do believe that that context, especially that you've just given about the Great Return March and bringing up the history and other examples throughout the Global South, is very important to understanding why a statement like what you've just said makes a lot of sense, and why, for instance, the condemnation of resistance doesn't make sense if you are truly an anti-imperialist and somebody who is an anti-racist as well, because you have to understand these things in their context when it comes to liberation struggles. I know we've taken quite a bit of your time today, and I sincerely thank you for this. And
thank you for having me.
Thank you very much for being on, and we'll hope to get you back on soon.
Now, if you like this video and interview and you want to see more, please support the Palestine Chronicle and make sure to like, subscribe, and share this video.